Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to learn how to create, delete, and modify local groups and group memberships. So first, let's understand where groups live. We learned about the Etsy password file and the Etsy shadow file. Now let's learn about the groups file. Let's take a look at it. It's cat group. Now inside of here shows all of the groups that are created and the membership for that specific group. So for example, if we did a grep for the wheel group, we could see what users belong to the wheel group. Now, another cool command we can use is the getInt command. We could say getInt group and then a specific username, for example, Anthony. And what this does is this returns all of the groups that Anthony belongs to. So let's learn a little bit about how to create a new group. So let's start fresh here and let's do a group add. I'm going to call this group class 1. Now, in order to see this, maybe we want to do getInt group, and it's going to list all of our groups there. We can also view the group file inside of our Etsy directory. We see that we have class 1. Well, let's create a new student. I'm going to say user add, and the student name is just going to be student. Now, if we want to take a look at the groups a student belongs to, not only can we use the getInt command, but we can also say groups student. And that's going to show the student's primary group and any supplementary groups that the user belongs to. Now, since this user belongs to, well, the usernames group that's created with it, let's go ahead and add this user to two groups. Let's add this user, the student, to both the class group, class 1 group, and the wheel group. Well, we must consider ourselves, do we want it to be the primary group or do we want it to be a supplementary group? Now, to demonstrate this, I am going to connect on a separate terminal to my linuxacademy.com lab servers. So we'll go File, Open Tab. I'm going to zoom in so you can see my screen better. And I'm going to go ahead and connect to it. So I'm going to connect as the student, paste it in. Make sure I set a password for the student. And now we're logged in. So for example, if I did touch file 1 and then an ls-al, we would see that the owner of the file is student and the group owner of the file is student. That's because my primary group is student. So let's go ahead and add or change my primary group. I want to change my primary group from student to class 1. Now to change my primary group, I use a lowercase g. So we'll do lowercase g, the group name, and then the user that we want to change. So if we take a look at groups student now, we'll see that this is the student's name, username, and this is the student's primary group, class 1. So if we were to do touch file 2 and we look at the ownership in here, well, you'll notice it is still the student. Why is that? Well, that's because we haven't been able to log out or log back in. So we changed the primary group, but I have to log out or log back in. Or I can actually change it by using new group and change it that way on our screen. But first, I'm going to go ahead and exit and log back in to demonstrate this. So we'll do touch file 3. We'll do an ls-al, and we have file 3, which shows the class 1 is the group because my primary group is the group that's going to determine the ownership of my directories and files whenever I create one for that specific user. Now, let's say that this student belongs to multiple classes. Now, we could have a directory structure that has specific group permissions, and we need to have that user have access to that specific group. So let's demonstrate this. Let's go into our /home directory, and I'm going to create a new directory called classes. And inside of this classes directory, let's go ahead and just change the classes directory to be full read-write privileges for all users. So we'll go inside the classes directory and create a couple files. So we'll call make dir. Let's make a couple files to start. So we'll create class 1, class 2, and class 3. Now, because I'm the root user, of course it's going to create those privileges with the root user. So I'm going to go ahead and chown permissions on this. I'm going to say chown root. It's going to be the user who owns the file. Class 1 is going to be the group that owns the file, and we're going to apply that to class 1. Now we're going to do that both for class 2 and class 3, but we need to make sure that we have a group class 2. So we'll do group add class 2 and group add class 3. Let's go ahead and modify our privileges. And now if we do an ls-al, we see there's permissions. So this student needs access to class 1 and class 2. And we're going to say that, well, permissions for this are going to be 0 permissions for the owner, but read-write permissions for a member who belongs to the group, and 0 permissions for everyone else. And we're going to apply that to class 1, and then we'll apply that to class 2. So really, anybody who's a member of class 1 and class 2 should have privileges to go into these groups. Let's see how this works. First, let's make sure our student has access. He does have access to class 1. That's his primary group. So I'm going to go into the home directory and try to navigate into, of course, my classes directory and then into class 1. Now I can navigate in there because I have privileges. I can actually create a file because I have privileges, because I belong, or the student, the user student belongs to class 1. But what about class 2? Well, I can't go into that directory, permission denied, because my student doesn't belong to class 2. Now, what I also want to demonstrate is let me ask this question to you. Just because the user belongs to the group, if it's not set as his primary group, do you think he has privileges to access the directory? Well, let's test that question. First, we need to add the student to a supplementary group for class 2. To do that, we want to append the group on there. If we don't, it will just replace it. So if I did just uppercase G, it would just replace a supplementary group. So I'm going to go ahead and append on there and do class 2. Now, of course, I can have a primary group and a supplementary group, but if I want more than one supplementary group, I need to use the -A flag or option. And make sure we specify the user student, and now we'll do groups student. You'll notice that he belongs to both class 1 and class 2. So first, let's go ahead and exit and log back in as the student on the system. I could have reloaded bash by just doing an exec bash, but it's easier to just log out and log back in. We'll go into our /home/classes directory, and then inside of our class 2 directory. And you'll notice that we have permission. Now, we have permission because we belong to the supplementary group. But when I create a new file, I'm creating it with the owner, group owner, as class 1. That's because the primary group of the user student is class 1. Class 2 is a secondary group. So when I'm inside of my folder here, maybe I want files and directories that I create to have proper permissions for class 2. How would I do that? Well, I would do new grp for new group, and I'll just say class 1. So that's going to change my primary group to class 1. If I touch file 3, ls-al, well, we used the new group, but we didn't pass it the dash behind it. So we have to do new group. So we do new group, class 1, dash. And that basically reinitializes it for us. So now if we touch a file, so maybe file 4, do an ls-al, of course it will be class 1 because we specified class 1. But if we do a new group, class 2, and then the dash to reload it, and then touch file 5, we see that it's being created with class 2 as our primary group. So that's how we switch back and forth between groups, and that's what a primary group does, right? So the primary group determines which group you're logged into. To change which supplementary group you're logged into, you can use new group. Now, the new group just allows us to log in and out of specific groups. The root user can change the primary group, which is the group the user belongs to when they log into the system. So for example, if we went back and did groups student, even though we set class 2 with new group, class 1 is still the primary group. All new group does is allow our logged in session to log into a group and log out of a group. In order to change the primary group, which is the group the user's logged into when he first logs into a system, that has to be done by modifying the user's account. So now that we've learned how to do that, let's learn how to change some group information. So if we take a look at the Etsy group file and we grep for student, we'll see that class 2 is a supplementary group for student. And then this is also the student group because when we added the user, the student was created. So let's say we add another user mod dash a uppercase G to add a supplementary group on the user. And we're going to add the user to class 2 and then the username. So if we take a look and we grep for our class 2 group, we can see that the user student and the user belongs to that group. I can also use getInt class 2 and it'll return the entry of that as well. So I can see what members belong to a group. But if I use the ID command, I can see what groups a student belongs to. I can also use groups student and it will show me the groups a student belongs to. So the ID might be a little bit cleaner because it shows the primary group and then the supplementary groups. So let's go ahead and try to change a group name. I can use that with group mod. Now if you need help, you can pass the -H flag. It's always good practice to know how to do this when you're in exam. So let's say I want to change the group name. Say change class 1 to class 5. We'll do a group mod -N for name. We're going to change the class name to class 5 for the group that's currently named class 1. So now if we take a look at our directory and we do a groups student, we see that the student's primary group is class 5. So we've renamed it, which also renames it in the Etsy group file. And you'll see that it's now class 5 instead of class 1. Now we see that class 5 has a group ID of 1004. Maybe we want to change the group ID. Well, we do that by doing a group mod -G for group ID, and maybe we're going to specify it to be 1010 for the group class 5. So again, if we take a look at it, cat Etsy group or getInt group class 5, we see that the ID has been changed to 1010. Now, when we're all done with our groups, we want to get rid of them. All we have to do is a group del class 2, group del class 3, group del class 5. What error message do we have? We can't remove a group that has a user using that group as its primary group. That'll cause issues for the user's account. So in order to completely remove it, we need to change back to a different primary group. Now this is the reason that whenever you create a new user, by default, it's configured to create a new group with that user's username. So we could just do user mod -G to change the primary group back to the student group name for the username student. So if we take a look and do groups student, we can see it's not there. And we can go back and do group del class 5 again, and it's no longer an issue. So we can do our getInt group command and it'll display all of our groups inside of our Etsy group file. And you'll notice our classes are no longer there. Groups allow us to group users together for a set of permissions. Let's say that we have an accounting group, and the accounting group can have access to specific accounting documents. Let's say that we want to give any arbitrary directory group ownership, right? So we can assign the accounting group ownership over an accounting document and allow read, write, execute privileges, and so on for that group. And any user that belongs to those groups can perform those permissions against that group. And we have an exercise at the end of this section that walks through doing exactly that. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson and move on.